In my family, grief was a competitive sport, and I was the only one who didn't seem to know the rules. The day my grandmother Eleanor passed away, my family mourned in a way that felt performative. There were loud, dramatic sighs, somber pronouncements about her legacy, and a whole lot of hushed, urgent phone calls to their financial advisors. Me, I just cried, and for that, for my genuine, messy, inconvenient tears, they called me dramatic. They had no idea my grandmother's final, brilliant act would be to turn their favorite insult into my greatest inheritance. If you've ever been made to feel like your emotions were an inconvenience, you're in the right place. My grandmother, Eleanor Vance, was a force of nature. She was a brilliant, eccentric, an unapologetically authentic woman who had built a small publishing empire from the ground up in an era when women were expected to do little more than host dinner parties. She was sharp, witty, and had a laugh that could fill a room. She was also the only person in my entire family who ever truly saw me. My family, the rest of them, are what you might call emotionally constipated. My father is a successful but stoic surgeon who views feelings as a messy, unnecessary complication, like a surgical site that refuses to stay sterile. My mother is a society woman whose primary concern is always what the neighbors will think. And my cousins, Jessica and Tom, are their parents' children shallow, materialistic, and obsessed with maintaining the perfect, polished facade of their lives. In this family of cool, collected performers, I was the anomaly. I was the sensitive one, the dramatic one, the one who felt things too deeply, cried too easily, and cared too much. My genuine emotional responses were treated like an embarrassing social faux pas, a stain on the family's pristine reputation. "Clara, for heaven's sake, pull yourself together." My mother would hiss at me at family gatherings if I got teary-eyed during a sad movie. "You're making a scene." "God, she's so dramatic," my cousin Jessica would whisper to Tom, just loud enough for me to hear. "It's like she enjoys being miserable." But my grandmother Eleanor never saw my sensitivity as a flaw. She saw it as a strength. "Don't you ever let them dull your sparkle, Clarabelle," she would tell me, her eyes twinkling. "Your heart is your compass. It feels things deeply because it's working properly. The rest of them," she'd say, with a dismissive wave of her hand, "their compasses are all pointing towards the nearest bank." She was my safe harbor. We would spend hours in her sprawling, book-filled library, talking about art and poetry and the meaning of life. She was the one who encouraged my passion for painting, even when my parents dismissed it as a messy hobby. She was the one who listened, who understood, who loved me not in spite of my emotional nature, but because of it. Her death, after a short, fierce battle with cancer, was the single most devastating event of my life. When I got the call, a raw, animal sound of grief tore from my throat. I was heartbroken. My family, on the other hand, seemed to move immediately into the logistical phase of mourning. The tears I saw in their eyes seemed less about the loss of a beloved matriarch, and more about the anticipated loss of a significant portion of their inheritance to taxes. The phone calls started almost immediately. I was staying at my grandmother's house, the place where I felt closest to her, and I could hear them in the other rooms, their voices hushed but urgent. I spoke to my financial advisor. My cousin Tom would be saying into his phone in the hallway. He said, "We need to be prepared for a significant estate tax. We need to make sure the executor is handling this properly." "Jessica, darling," my mother would be whispering to my cousin, "make sure you wear the pearl necklace Eleanor gave you to the funeral. It's important to show how much she meant to you. It shows respect." They weren't mourning her. They were positioning themselves. They were treating her death like a corporate merger. And the will reading was the final, high-stakes negotiation. Their grief was a costume they put on, a performance for an audience of one my grandmother's lawyer. I, on the other hand, was a mess. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I would wander through my grandmother's beautiful, silent house, touching her books, smelling the faint scent of her perfume on her favorite shawl, and just weep. My grief was a raw, open wound, and to my family, it was an embarrassment. "Clara, you really need to get a hold of yourself," my father said to me the day before the funeral, finding me crying in the library. "This level of emotional display, it's not healthy, and frankly, it's making everyone else uncomfortable." "I'm sad, Dad," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Grandma is gone. Doesn't that make you uncomfortable?" He just sighed. That familiar, frustrated sigh of a man who simply could not compute the language of feelings. "We are all sad, Clara," he said, "but we are handling it with dignity. You are being dramatic. Dramatic." The word was a slap in the face. My genuine, soul-crushing grief was being dismissed as a performance, while their cold, calculated maneuvering was being lauded as dignity. The night before the funeral, I couldn't sleep. I found myself in my grandmother's study, looking for something, anything, that would make me feel close to her again. I opened the drawer of her large, antique desk and found her personal journal. My heart pounded. I knew I shouldn't, but the temptation was too strong. I needed to hear her voice one last time. I opened it to the last entry, dated just a few weeks before she passed. Her elegant, spidery handwriting was a little shaky, but her words were as sharp as ever. "The vultures are circling," she had written. "They think I don't see them," with their fake smiles and their sudden, convenient concern for my comfort. They move through my house like they're already measuring for new curtains. They are mourning an inheritance, not a person, all of them. Except for my Clarabelle, my beautiful, sensitive, dramatic girl. She is the only one who has ever loved me for me, not for my money. She feels everything. They call it a weakness. I know it is her superpower. And I have one last, grand, and perhaps slightly cruel, trick up my sleeve to prove it. They want a performance. Oh, I'll give them a performance they will never forget. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. I had no idea what she meant, what trick she had planned, but reading her words, feeling her love and her fierce, protective spirit reaching out to me from beyond the grave, gave me a small sliver of strength. She saw me, she understood, and she had a plan. I didn't know what it was, but as I prepared myself for the ordeal of the funeral, I held on to her last words like a secret. A promise, a piece of armor against the cold, judgmental world of my family. The funeral was a masterclass in performative grief. It was held at a grand, old stone church, the kind my mother approved of because it photographed well. The pews were filled with my family's friends and business associates. A sea of somber, expensive black suits and tasteful pearl necklaces. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, the official flower of respectable. Understated sorrow and the sound of my family accepting condolences with a practiced, solemn grace. My father stood at the front of the church, looking every bit the grieving son. He spoke of his mother's strength and dignity, his voice carefully modulated to convey a deep, but controlled, sadness. My brother and his wife sat in the front pew, holding hands, their faces a perfect mask of stoic mourning. My cousin Jessica, a woman who hadn't voluntarily visited my grandmother in over 5 years, dabbed at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, a single, perfect, camera-ready tear tracing a path down her cheek. They were all playing their parts beautifully. They were actors in a play. And the stage was my grandmother's funeral. I, on the other hand, was a wreck. I couldn't perform. I couldn't pretend. The grief was a physical thing, a heavy, crushing weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. The sound of the organ, the sight of her casket at the front of the church, the empty space beside me where she should have been, it was all too much. I sat in the front pew, wedged between my stoic parents, and I sobbed, not loudly, not hysterically, but with the deep, shuddering, unstoppable tears of someone whose heart has been shattered. My mother kept patting my hand, her touch not one of comfort, but of urgent, embarrassed command. "Clara, get a hold of yourself," she hissed under her breath, a tight, angry smile plastered on her face for the benefit of the other mourners. "People are staring. You're being dramatic." I couldn't stop. The tears were a river, and I was drowning in them during the eulogy, a beautiful tribute delivered by one of my grandmother's oldest friends. I had to excuse myself, stumbling out of the pew and into the quiet solitude of the church vestibule, just so I could breathe. The reception afterwards was held at my grandmother's sprawling, beautiful home. It was a catered affair, of course. My family wouldn't have dreamed of anything less. The house was filled with the same somber-faced guests, now balancing plates of tiny, elegant sandwiches and glasses of expensive white wine. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones about Eleanor's wonderful life, while simultaneously speculating about the size of her estate. I found a quiet corner in the library, my grandmother's favorite room, hoping to escape the suffocating performance of it all. But my family found me, my cousins, Jessica and Tom, cornered me by the fireplace. "Okay, Clara, the funeral is over," Jessica said, her voice a sharp, impatient whisper. "You can stop with the waterworks now. It's getting embarrassing." "Embarrassing?" I asked, my voice hoarse from crying. "Jessica, our grandmother just died. I'm sad." "We're all sad," Tom chimed in, rolling his eyes. "But we're not making a spectacle of ourselves. You were practically wailing in the church. It was so dramatic. What must people have thought?" "I don't care what people thought," I said. "I cared about Grandma." "We all cared about Grandma," Jessica snapped. "But this whole most sensitive soul in the world act is getting really old. You're an adult. You need to learn how to control your emotions." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They were criticizing my genuine, heartfelt grief, while they had spent the entire day performing a carefully choreographed ballet of fake sadness. Their concern wasn't for my emotional well-being. It was for their own social standing. My messy, authentic sorrow was a threat to their carefully constructed image of perfect, dignified mourning. Later, I overheard them talking to my mother in the kitchen. "I just don't know what to do with her," my mother was saying with a heavy sigh. "She's always been so dramatic, so emotional. It's like she gets some kind of pleasure out of being the center of attention." "It's a lack of self-control," my father's voice added, his tone full of a detached, clinical disapproval. "Eleanor was always too soft on her. She encouraged her dramatics." They were diagnosing my grief as a personality flaw, a character defect that my grandmother had foolishly enabled. They were so busy judging the style of my mourning that they had completely missed the substance of it. They couldn't see my pain because they were blinded by their own greed. As the last of the guests finally departed, leaving the family alone in the quiet, echoing house, the conversation immediately turned to the one thing they all truly cared about, the will. "So, when is Davies reading the will?" Tom asked, already pouring himself a large glass of my grandmother's best scotch. Mr. Davies was my grandmother's lawyer, a stern, old-school gentleman who had been her trusted confidant for over 40 years. "He called this afternoon," my father said. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Here." A palpable sense of excitement, of greedy anticipation, filled the room. The performance was over. The real business was about to begin. They started speculating about the contents of the will, their voices a low, conspiratorial buzz. "She promised me her diamond earrings years ago," Jessica said. "The beach house has to go to me and my family," Tom declared. "We used it the most." I just sat there, silent, listening to them carve up my grandmother's life before she was even cold in the ground. The grief I felt was now mixed with a profound, sickening sense of disgust. I looked at their faces, so full of avarice and entitlement, and I thought of my grandmother's last journal entry. "They want a performance. Oh, I'll give them a performance they will never forget." I didn't know what she had planned, but as I sat there, the dramatic granddaughter, the emotional one, the one who was a complete and total outsider in her own family, I felt a strange sense of calm. The game was afoot, and for the first time, I had a feeling that the rules were about to change in my favor. The next morning, my family gathered in my grandmother Eleanor's library for the reading of the will. The room, which had always been my sanctuary, a place of quiet comfort and shared stories, now felt like a theater, and the air was thick with the tense, greedy energy of an opening night. They had all dressed for the occasion. My mother wore a somber but impeccably tailored black dress, a single strand of pearls at her throat. My father looked grave and serious in his best suit. My cousin Jessica had positioned herself in a chair directly opposite the lawyer's desk, and she was holding a small, framed photograph of herself and my grandmother, which she would occasionally gaze at with a look of profound, theatrical sadness. It was a grotesque and silent competition. The Grief Olympics, as my grandmother had called it in her journal, had officially begun. I chose a seat in a worn leather armchair in the corner, Away from the rest of them, I felt like a ghost, an observer in my own family. My grief was a quiet, heavy cloak, and I had no interest in participating in their performance. My silence, I could tell, was interpreted by them as sullenness, as me being dramatic in a different way. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mr. Davies arrived. He was a tall, stern, old-school lawyer in his late 70s, a man who had been my grandmother's lawyer and trusted confidant for nearly 50 years. He carried a heavy, worn leather briefcase, and his face was an unreadable mask of professional solemnity. He greeted my parents with a curt nod, his eyes sweeping over my eager cousins with a look of faint, almost imperceptible disapproval. When his eyes landed on me, huddled in my corner, his expression softened for just a fraction of a second. He gave me a small, kind nod of acknowledgement. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. He saw me, he remembered me, and I had a feeling he knew exactly what my grandmother had planned. He sat down behind my grandmother's massive mahogany desk, placed his briefcase on top, and opened it with a series of loud, definitive clicks that echoed in the silent room. He pulled out a thick document, bound in a dark blue cover, the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance. "Good morning," he began, his voice a dry, gravelly monotone. "We are gathered here today to execute the final wishes of my dear friend and client, Eleanor, as the executor of her estate. It is my duty to read her last will and testament in its entirety. Please, hold all questions until the end." My family leaned forward in their chairs as one, a collective, hungry organism. Mr. Davies put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses and began to read. The first part of the will was filled with the dry, formal legal language that made my eyes glaze over. Then came the minor bequests. "To my loyal housekeeper of 30 years, Mrs. Gable," he read, "for her unwavering service and her excellent scones, I leave a sum of $20,000 to be paid from the estate." There was a polite, if slightly impatient, murmur from the family. "To the Harmony Creek Public Library," he continued, "I leave a sum of $50,000 for the specific purpose of renovating the children's wing. A love of books is the greatest gift one can give a child." "And to the Oakwood County Animal Shelter," he went on, "where my dear granddaughter Clara has volunteered for the past 5 years, and from where she rescued her beloved, Scruffy Mutt, I leave a donation of $50,000, with the stipulation that it be used for new bedding and better quality food." I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. She had remembered my dog. She had remembered my volunteer work. I looked down at my hands, my vision blurring with tears. Across the room, I could feel my cousin Jessica's resentful glare. The first points in this bizarre competition had been scored, and they had gone to me. Mr. Davies continued, his voice a steady drone, reading through clauses about paying off my grandmother's minor debts, her credit card, her utility bills, all the normal, procedural parts of a will. I could feel the impatience growing in the room. My family didn't care about the housekeeper or the library. They were waiting for the main event. They were waiting for the real estate, the stock portfolio, the art collection, the multi-million-dollar prize. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Davies reached the final section of the document. He paused. He took off his reading glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. He looked up and surveyed the room, his gaze resting for a moment on each of my family members' eager, greedy faces. "And now," he said, his voice heavy with a significance that made the air in the room crackle, "we come to the final clause. This clause pertains to the disposition of the remainder of the estate, which, as you all know, is substantial." My father sat up straighter. My mother held her breath. Jessica placed the framed photo of her and my grandmother strategically in her lap, ready for her close-up. Mr. Davies put his glasses back on. He looked down at the page in front of him, and then he read the words that would unleash utter chaos into the quiet, hallowed space of my grandmother's library, the words that would change my life forever. Mr. Davies adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, the small movement echoing loudly in the silent, expectant room. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the sea of my family's greedy, hopeful faces, before landing back on the final page of my grandmother's will. "And now," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of significance, We come to the final clause. This clause pertains to the disposition of the remainder of the estate of Eleanor Vance, which, as you all are aware, is substantial. I saw my cousin Jessica straighten her back, a small, triumphant smile already forming on her lips. My mother subtly placed her hand over the pearl necklace Eleanor had given her, a silent claim. They were all poised, ready to receive the prize they felt they were owed. Mr. Davies cleared his throat and began to read, but the words that came out of his mouth were not what anyone was expecting. They were not dry, legal terms. They were the voice of my grandmother, her sharp, witty, and slightly cruel spirit speaking to us one last time from beyond the grave. I have watched my family for many years, Mr. Davies read, his voice taking on the cadence of my grandmother's speech. I have seen their performances, their posturing, their concerns which often seem more financial than familial. I have seen the way they circle, the way they flatter, the way they compete. And in my final days, I have decided to reward the one thing that has always been in such short supply in this family: genuine emotion. A confused murmur went through the room. My father shot my mother a bewildered look. Mr. Davies continued, his voice unwavering. Therefore, I have decided to leave my final, and most substantial, gift not to the most successful, or the most dutiful, or the most fawning of my relatives, but to the one who truly loved me the most. He paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. And so, he read, his voice clear and ringing with a terrible, final authority. I hereby decree that the entirety of my remaining estate, the house and all its contents, the stock portfolio, the art collection, and all residual assets shall be bequeathed in full to the one single member of my immediate family who, in the days following my passing, demonstrates themselves to be the most truly and profoundly grieved. For a moment, there was only a stunned, absolute silence as my family's brains struggled to process the sheer, magnificent insanity of what they had just heard. And then, chaos erupted. "What does that mean?" my uncle shouted, surging to his feet. "Is that even legal?" Akiha, my aunt cried, her face pale with shock. "This is a joke. It has to be a joke," my cousin Tom exclaimed. They all turned on Mr. Davies. A barrage of angry, confused questions. Who decides? How is it judged? This is preposterous. Mr. Davies just sat there, impassive. Until their shouting subsided, he held up a hand for silence. The will is perfectly legal, ironclad, and was certified by a judge with Mrs. Vance present and in a state of exceptionally sound mind. He said coolly. As for how it will be judged, he continued, Eleanor was, as in all things, very specific. He looked down at the will again. The sole and final arbiter of this condition shall be the executor of my will, my dear and trusted friend, Mr. Alistair Davies. His judgment on this matter is absolute, non-negotiable, and legally binding. He will make his decision based on his own observations of the family's conduct. Good luck, he finished, a flicker of something that looked like grim amusement in his eyes. And may the best mourner win. The room was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of greedy, calculating minds, all simultaneously realizing the new rules of the game. The Grief Olympics had officially begun, and my family, a group of lifelong performers, were ready for the competition. My cousin Jessica was the first to make her move. Her face, which had been a mask of confusion, suddenly crumpled into a grotesque pantomime of sorrow. A loud, theatrical wail tore from her throat, a sound so artificial it was almost comical. "Oh, Gam Gam!" she shrieked, throwing herself from her chair and onto the expensive Persian rug. "My precious, precious Gam Gam! How can I live without you? The world is so much darker now," she began to sob, her shoulders heaving dramatically, her eyes darting around the room to make sure everyone was watching her award-worthy performance. Her brother, Tom, not to be outdone, stood up and began to pace the room, running a hand through his hair distractedly. I can't believe she's gone," he said, his voice thick with a fake, breaking emotion. "Just last week, we were talking about the Stoics. She was so brilliant," she said to me. "Tom, my boy, remember Marcus Aurelius? He was fabricating a deep, philosophical last conversation. positioning himself as her intellectual heir. My mother launched into her own strategy, clutching the pearl necklace at her throat. She gave me these pearls, she began to weep, her voice a high, thin wail. She said they were for the daughter she never had. She loved me best. She always did. It was a circus, a grotesque, horrifying, and deeply insulting circus of fake grief. They were not mourning my grandmother. They were desecrating her memory, turning their love for her into a competitive sport with a multi-million-dollar prize. I just sat in my corner, my own quiet, real grief, a leaden weight in my stomach. I watched them, disgusted and horrified. My tears had finally dried up, replaced by a cold, quiet nausea. I thought of my grandmother, of her wicked sense of humor, of her deep disdain for anything fake or performative. And I finally, truly understood her last journal entry. They want a performance. Oh, I'll give them a performance they will never forget. This wasn't just a will. It was her final, brilliant, and terrible test. It was a trap, designed to expose them for exactly what they were, and they had all walked right into it, singing and dancing and wailing all the way. Mr. Davies just sat behind the desk, his face a mask of stone, watching them. But I saw his eyes, just for a second, flick over to me, and in them, I saw the same thing I had seen in my grandmother's, a glint of something that looked an awful lot like a shared, secret joke. The scene in my grandmother's library, a room that had once been a bastion of quiet intellectualism and warm conversation, had devolved into a grotesque, competitive theater of the absurd. The will's final, bizarre clause had transformed my grieving family into a troupe of bad actors, each one vying for the lead role in a play called The Grieving Heir. My cousin Jessica, naturally, was the star of the show. Her initial, theatrical sobs on the floor had subsided, and she had now moved into the monologue phase of her performance. She had strategically positioned herself near Mr. Davies's desk, clutching the framed photo of her and my grandmother like an Oscar. "I remember," she began, her voice a dramatic, trembling whisper that was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just last month, Gam Gam and I were sitting in the garden. She took my hand, and she looked at me with those wise, old eyes, and she said, 'Jessica, darling, you are the only one who has my fire. You are the one who will carry on my legacy.'" Tears streamed down her perfectly made-up face. It was a beautiful story. It was also a complete lie. I had been with my grandmother almost every day of that last month, and Jessica hadn't visited once, not to be outdone. Her brother Tom launched his own campaign. His angle was not emotional, but intellectual. He was the deep, sensitive soul who had truly understood Eleanor's brilliant mind. He picked up a leather-bound copy of Shakespeare's sonnets from a nearby shelf. She adored Keats, of course, he announced to the room, getting the poet wrong in a way that was almost painful. She always said he captured the bittersweet nature of mortality so perfectly. He opened the book and began to read a sonnet, his voice full of a deep, fake profundity. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" He read, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was one of the most famous, most cliché sonnets in the English language, and he was presenting it as if it were a secret, shared text between him and our grandmother. My parents had teamed up. Their strategy was to portray themselves as the dutiful, long-suffering children who had borne the burden of her care. The nights were the hardest. My mother wept, dabbing her dry eyes with her handkerchief. But we were always there for her, holding her hand, reading to her. She wasn't just a mother, she was our best friend. It was a constant, escalating battle of one-upmanship. If my aunt told a story about how Eleanor had loved her rose garden, my uncle would counter with a story about how he had been the one to help her plant it. They were all performing, their eyes constantly darting towards Mr. Davies, the silent, stone-faced judge of their grief Olympics. They were checking to see if their performances were landing, if he was being moved by their transparently false displays of sorrow. And Mr. Davies just sat there. He watched them, his face impassive, his hands steepled under his chin. He let them talk. He let them weave their webs of lies. He let them expose the full, ugly, grasping nature of their greed. His silence was a damning judgment in itself. I, on the other hand, felt like I was going to be sick. The disgust was a physical thing, a sour taste in the back of my throat. This was my grandmother, my brilliant, funny, wonderful grandmother, and they were turning her memory into a vulgar, competitive farce. The quiet, real, and deeply painful grief inside me felt like a sacred thing being desecrated by this circus. I couldn't watch them anymore. I stood up quietly and walked over to the towering bookshelves that lined the library walls. I ran my fingers over the worn spines of her books, her real friends. I found the one I was looking for, a thin, well-worn volume of poetry by Mary Oliver, my grandmother's true favorite. Her copy was filled with her own spidery annotations in the margins, with underlined passages and little penciled-in stars. I took the book back to my chair in the corner and just held it. I didn't open it. I just sat there, my thumb stroking the soft, worn leather of the cover, lost in my own quiet. Real memories of her. The sound of their competitive wailing faded into a distant, meaningless buzz. In my own quiet corner, I was having a real moment of mourning. The chaos in the room reached a fever pitch when Jessica, in a stroke of theatrical genius, let out a small ladylike gasp and fainted delicately onto a nearby chaise lounge. Her brother, Tom, rushed to her side, fanning her face with a leather-bound book, while my mother cried out, "Oh, the grief is too much for the poor child. She loved her more than any of us." And that was when Mr. Davies finally decided he had seen enough. He didn't shout. He didn't bang a gavel. He simply cleared his throat. It was not a loud sound, but it cut through the cacophony of their fake sorrow like a gunshot. The room fell instantly, completely silent. Jessica, miraculously, revived from her fainting spell. Tom stopped fanning. My mother stopped wailing. Every single eye in the room was now fixed on the old lawyer behind the desk. He slowly, deliberately, took off his glasses. He looked around the room, at each of their expectant, tear-streaked, greedy faces. "Thank you," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. "I believe I have seen and heard everything I need to make my determination." The family held its breath as one. The performances were over. The time for judging had begun. The silence in my grandmother's library was absolute. The air was thick with the residue of their fake sorrow and the heavy weight of their very real greed. My family, a pack of wolves who had just finished mauling each other for a prize, now sat panting, their eyes all fixed on the man who held their fate in his hands. They had composed their faces back into masks of pious, hopeful grief, each one certain that their performance had been the most convincing. Mr. Davies slowly put his glasses back on his desk. He surveyed the room, his gaze moving from one family member to the next, lingering for a moment on each of their pathetic, expectant faces. "I knew Eleanor Vance for 52 years, he began, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "I was her lawyer, her confidant, and her friend. I knew her mind, I knew her heart, and I knew," he said, his eyes flicking towards my cousin Jessica, her absolute, unwavering contempt for anything false, shallow, or performative. A nervous ripple went through the room. "The last hour in this room has been illuminating," he continued, his voice as dry as dust. "I have witnessed declarations of undying love. I have heard recitations of poetry. I have seen fainting spells. And I have heard a truly spectacular amount of wailing. I have seen a masterclass in theatrics." He leaned forward slightly, his old eyes sharp and piercing. "But your grandmother's will was not a casting call for a play. It was a test of character, and it was a test of what it means to truly grieve." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "True grief, the profound grief that Eleanor spoke of, is rarely a loud, competitive performance. It is not a story you tell to an audience to prove your love. True grief," he said, his voice softening, "is a quiet, hollow, and deeply personal space in the heart. It is the silent tear on a cheek when you think no one is looking. It is the comfort found not in a public wail, but in the simple, treasured memory held in the pages of a beloved, worn-out book." As he spoke that last line, his eyes flickered almost imperceptibly towards me, and towards the small volume of Mary Oliver poetry I was still clutching in my lap. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I was at the funeral service on Saturday, Mr. Davies said, his gaze sweeping the room again. I watched all of you. I saw your dignified composure. I saw your public displays of sadness. He then turned his full attention, his full, unwavering gaze, directly on me. But I only saw one person who was genuinely, uncontrollably, and profoundly heartbroken by the loss of Eleanor Vance. He stated, his voice ringing with a new, clear authority. I only saw one person whose grief was so real, so authentic, that it was seen by everyone else as an inconvenience, an embarrassment, a dramatic scene. He looked directly at my family. You were all so busy performing your grief that you failed to notice the only person in this room who was actually feeling it. He stood up, tall and imposing behind the desk. My judgment is not based on the circus I have witnessed in this room today. It is based on the quiet, messy, and deeply real tears I saw at the church. The only person who has demonstrated true and profound grief, in my legal and personal judgment, is Clara. He picked up the will from the desk. His decision made. Therefore, he declared, his voice booming in the silent room. As per the legally binding and non-negotiable terms of the will, the entirety of the remaining estate of Eleanor Vance, with all its assets, properties, and accounts, belongs to her granddaughter, Clara Evans. He looked at me. Congratulations, my dear, it's all yours. The implosion was instantaneous. What, shrieked my cousin Jessica, leaping to her feet, her grief miraculously cured. That's a fix, it's a joke, she cried the most, so she gets everything. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard. You can't be serious, Alistair, my father roared, his face a mask of furious disbelief. We were her children, she's just a granddaughter, we will contest this in court. Mr. Davies just looked at them, a weary, almost pitying expression on his face. Feel free to try, he said calmly. The will is ironclad. Your mother, as you know, was very thorough. She knew you all very, very well. I was just as shocked as they were. I sat there, stunned, my mind reeling. I hadn't been playing a game. I wasn't competing. I was just sad. And my grandmother, my brilliant, eccentric, wonderful grandmother, had seen that. Her final act on this earth was to validate my deepest feelings, to turn my perceived weakness, my dramatic heart, into my greatest strength. My family left my house that day in a storm of fury and slammed doors. The legal challenges they threatened never materialized, as Mr. Davies predicted. The will was unbreakable. The weeks that followed were strange. I was now the matriarch of a family that resented me, the owner of a fortune I had never expected. But for the first time, I felt powerful, not because of the money, but because of the validation. My grandmother's final gift to me wasn't the house, or the stocks, or the art collection. It was the truth. It was a lesson, her final, brilliant lesson, that in a world full of performers, the most radical and powerful thing you can be is authentic. My family called me dramatic, because my feelings were too big for their small, controlled world. My grandmother saw that same drama, and she called it what it was, love, in the end. The real inheritance wasn't the money in the bank. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge that my sensitive heart, the one they had all called a weakness, was, in fact, my greatest and most valuable asset, and it was priceless.